passionate. I'm super passionate about all things diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We can get started today with a really fun icebreaker. So why don't you share in the chat the current temperature where you are? I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and for us, it's in the 50s. We're getting up to the 70s this morning, for the afternoon rather. So Robinson, if you want to just kind of keep an eye on that chat, and I will just do a brief introduction of myself, and then we'll move forward with the presentation. So I am, my background's in marketing, and I used to absolutely love promotion and awareness and brand strategy. And what I realized is that there was a higher calling and a higher purpose for my life and my career. And I found diversity and inclusion and have just never looked back. And so I'm currently at IBM. I serve as a learning program manager. I manage our digital learning portfolio for 340,000 global employees, all levels of the organization, technical and non-technical. And my real inspiration for this presentation is just the power of knowledge. The more you know, the better you can navigate the world and the more sensitive you can be to others. And it's just so exciting when we think about the possibilities of being successful personally and professionally, how culture really plays such a big role in that. So let me just check the chat real quick before we get started. Michelle says 41 degrees in Queens. Okay, Sarah says she's wearing knitwear, so it must be cold. Teresa's cold in her office. Yes, it is definitely chilly. Nadia says 39 degrees in New York City. And Sarah says outside 40, inside 68. I'm with you. I keep the thermostat warm too. So a lot of you all are in New York, which is amazing and very exciting. And I'm excited to be with you today. So I'm excited to share with you a little bit more about cultural intelligence, which truly is a secret weapon for success. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, share them in the chat and we'll cover them at the end. And we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see what happened here. Oh, it went through. Okay. So we're going to get started and we'll talk about culture and identity. And when you think about culture, there's just so many different elements of what culture truly is. Culture is embedded in your values, in your belief system, the music you listen to, the languages you speak, the food you eat, your traditions and your rituals. A lot of them are based on your community and your identity, your family, and some culture dimensions are really just a personal choice, right? So when we think about culture and identity, it's very intersectional because a lot of our culture is a huge part of how we define ourselves. And it's also how we function in the world, right? Those stories and those norms and just how you live your life. Your culture plays a really big part in your overall lifestyle. So I want to just get some interaction going here. I want you to share in the chat what is one aspect of your culture. One aspect of my culture is my faith and my religious beliefs. I grew up in a non-denominational church, and as a Christian, I now subscribe to a Baptist church, and my faith is a huge part of how I function in the world, how I operate, how I show up, the things I think about, my value system. It's a huge part of my culture, and it's a huge part of how my family and I interact, how we celebrate holidays, and how we interact with each other, especially during difficult times, if there's a tricky situation either between our family or in the world. So let's see, we've got a couple of chat messages. So Teresa has shared hospitality, Middle Eastern. Sarah shares self-sufficiency. Raquel agrees about her faith. I'd love to know an aspect of your culture. You can certainly share with us in the chat and we'll keep the interaction going for the presentation. Love it. Basila says, my heritage, Commonwealth of Dominica. Very exciting. Yes, it's definitely a huge part of your culture. Absolutely. Robinson says family values, language. Clara says food. Nadia says community. Tawana, the value I place on education. Absolutely. So much of this is very, very important. And it's a huge part of how we function and how we show up in our identities. So let's break it down. A lot of people are very familiar with EQ, also known as emotional intelligence. It's your ability to have insight about people's feelings, their desires, their wants, and also their needs, and understanding how your emotions and your behavior really affects others, how that really influences those interactions. Cultural intelligence, on the other hand, is the ability to be attuned to the values and the beliefs and attitudes of people from different cultures and to respond with informed empathy and real understanding. So, in a world with a lot of diversity around culture, we certainly want to be understanding and very empathetic to the different cultural norms and different cultural dimensions that others value, believe, and are important to them. And so that's really what the heart of cultural intelligence is all about. So when we think about cultural intelligence, this was a concept that was created by Christopher Early and Soon Eng in 2003. They created this concept in their book, Cultural Intelligence, which you see in a screenshot on the top right here. And it's all about this ability to adapt to new and different cultural settings. And it's really about celebrating and appreciating those differences, not ignoring them, and certainly not being disrespectful to them, because we all have different cultural values and different cultural identities as well. So these are some of the different characteristics that we see when people have a high level of cultural intelligence. They're able to identify the impact of culture. They can recognize shared influences among groups. They can make informed judgments based on observations. They can enter new environments with confidence and really understand that cultural influence is intersectional with other identity dimensions, like what we talked about earlier. Cultural influences are complex, and a lot of them are very interconnected. Culture is significant, and factors like business roles and individual personalities also have a powerful effect on behavior. So when we think about someone's culture, is that the influence or the motivating factor for a particular action or attitude or personality dimension or even a behavior? And it's really not just the cultural identity in isolation, but it's a combination of culture and identity when we look at how people show up and how people function in the world. So let's look at an example. Let's say you have a meeting with a Brazilian stockbroker for coffee. Does this person behave the way that they do because they're Brazilian? Is it because they're a stockbroker, or is it because they're a Brazilian stockbroker? Or maybe it's because they're a millennial, or they're in Gen X, or they could be an introvert or an extrovert. It's likely a combination of all of the elements that make a person who they are. So it's best to avoid generalizing based on just one dimension of a person's identity. A lot of times when people think of the culture of someone, they're thinking of their racial or ethnic background, but culture really does span beyond just race and ethnicity. And it's important that we see people as a whole for who they are, rather than trying to just isolate one particular dimension of their identity. So there's three main elements of cultural intelligence. And the first is the head. It's the knowledge, the observation, and the research of information to recognize a culture's shared understandings. The second element is the body. It's the translation of cultural information into visible actions, like body language or gestures. And the third element is the heart. It's the ability to be confident, not afraid to make honest mistakes, and tenacity to keep improving by tackling new cultural situations. I want to spend a second here to talk a little bit more about the heart, because honestly, when people put themselves in new situations, when they're maybe in a new environment or they're meeting new people that are different from themselves, there's this tendency to have fear, anxiety, and overwhelm and to just shut down. And it's important to really be vulnerable when you're connecting with new people. Be eager and curious to learn more about them. And also be honest about any mistakes you make. And you certainly want to be humble and apologize when it's appropriate. A lot of times, I think in my work, I see that people are very eager to just completely throw out the baby with the bathwater. If they make a mistake, they just want to shut down and they don't want to interact in a new environment or with other people different from themselves. But let's face it, that's the world we live in. We are all different and we have to be able to embrace those differences. And if mistakes are made, we need to own up to them and just apologize and learn from that moment and learn from the lesson so that it's not repeated again in the future. There's a lot of benefits of cultural intelligence, and this is why it's really a secret weapon for success, especially when we look at team building and teamwork and collaboration. Any relationship that you have, whether it's personal or professional, you will definitely benefit from using the power of cultural intelligence in that interaction. David Livermore, PhD, is the president of the Cultural Intelligence Center in East Lansing, Michigan. And he wrote several books on cultural intelligence, including Leading with Cultural Intelligence, in which he quoted, "When people feel a leader doesn't understand or respect their cultural norms or the challenges of working around a given culture's holidays or traditions, it can undermine teamwork, productivity, and trust." For anyone who's in a leadership role, or even if you are a leader outside of work in a community capacity, in your family, anywhere in life, you certainly want to be very sensitive to the other cultural holidays and traditions and norms and rituals so that you can be a leader that is empathetic and compassionate about what's important to the people that you collaborate and you work with. There's so many benefits of cultural intelligence. Here's just a few. It increases engagement, it increases innovation, and it even increases profitability. It helps to build trust and rapport with others, and it's a competitive advantage that you can leverage for success. Dr. Livermore reports that 90% of leading executives from 68 countries said that cross-cultural skills are one of the most vital capabilities in order to remain competitive. Let's face it, most organizations are global, which means that in a given team, you have several different professionals from different countries, from different continents, which brings in a lot of different cultures. And it's so important to really take the time to get to know people as humans, not just as workers or co-workers, so that you can truly embrace and respect who they are and how they show up in the world. That will set you apart as a good leader anywhere you are, work or in life. Deloitte has identified 6 traits of inclusive leaders. Cultural intelligence happens to be one of those 6. Can you guess another trait? I'd love to see it in the chat. So Deloitte did this research and they identified 6 really important traits for inclusive leaders globally. And cultural intelligence was one of those traits. I'd love to see in the chat anything that you can guess about the other traits that were identified. There's 5 other traits of inclusive leaders. What do you think one of those traits might be? Let me open up the chat here so I can see the messages coming in. Okay, Sarah says empathy. Teresa says emotional intelligence. I'm seeing empathy a lot. Curiosity, active listening, tolerance, good listening. Very good. Flexibility. These are some really great traits for inclusive leaders. Think about like the perfect boss, the ideal supervisor that you could have. What would those traits be? Someone is saying respect, flexibility, being welcoming. That's so important. Collaboration, being open to discussion, being open to feedback. That's a big one, Teresa. Someone who is fair. Fairness is so important, Esther. I agree. Vulnerability, empathy again. Awesome. Thank you. I love to see the interaction in the chat. So these are the 6 different traits. So cultural intelligence is what we're covering today. Let's look at the 5 others. Curiosity, and that's because different ideas and experiences enable growth, and that's very important, having that level of curiosity. Cognizance, because bias is a leader's Achilles heel. Bias is a huge topic we're not going to cover today. We just don't have the time, but hopefully Robinson can coordinate an event around bias if you haven't already had a discussion around that. It's a hot topic in the diversity and inclusion world. Courage, because talking about imperfections involves personal risk-taking. Absolutely. So that really couples with vulnerability, like someone said in the chat earlier. Commitment, because staying the course is hard. Absolutely, even when it gets tough. And collaboration, Raquel said that in the chat, because a diverse thinking team is greater than the sum of its parts. So important to have all 6 of these traits, and Deloitte did some amazing research around inclusive leadership. This is one of the resource links that Robinson has for you, and it'll be on the landing page for this speaker series event. So let's talk about how you can improve your cultural intelligence. There's really 4 main ways, or 4 main categories. And the first is around drive. It's having the motivation to learn and to respond to different cultures. Here's a couple of things you can do around the motivation piece. You can connect with people from different cultures. You can volunteer for projects that will expose you to new cultures, or you could learn a new language. And now with Netflix and YouTube, it's incredibly easy to have that access to just watch sitcoms, watch documentaries. You can learn a new language by watching others speak and by hearing that language, and that really helps to reinforce that new skill set. The second way is around knowledge. Knowledge is the understanding of how culture shapes people's behaviors, their values, and their beliefs. You can learn about different cultural norms. You can also learn about the history of different cultures. And it's important to know the holidays of different cultures, particularly of those around you in your close-knit circle, whether it's personally, your friendships, or at work especially. You'd hate to have a deadline on a project that falls on a holiday of one of your coworkers or one of your direct reports. So knowing the really important holidays for your team is a great way to display cultural intelligence. Strategy is the third way, and it's the planning and the implementation of robust, culturally sensitive practices. A few things you can do are to observe the media for different cultural insights. You can question your assumptions. Whatever you may think of initially may not be the best response or the best course of action to take. You can also keep track of your cultural interactions, being mindful and being really intentional to make sure that they actually occur and that you're learning and connecting with others that are different from yourself. And the last way is action, how you behave and how you react when things don't always go according to plan. You can learn business etiquette practices for different cultures, especially if you're going to be globally traveling whenever this pandemic is over. You can certainly have cultural intelligence when you're meeting or traveling abroad with people from different countries and different continents. You can monitor your own body language and, of course, respectfully apologize whenever mistakes occur. Mistakes are going to happen. It's just important that you acknowledge them and you're sincere when you apologize, and you can move on. So I'd love to know from you in the chat, what is one action that you can take to improve your cultural intelligence? I remember a couple of years ago, I wanted to learn Spanish and I was fully committed to taking classes and watching telenovelas, especially on Netflix, but life got hectic and it kind of fell to the wayside. And so learning another language is one thing that I certainly want to take up and definitely enjoy as I am being more culturally intelligent myself. So let's see in the chat, what is one thing that you can do to improve your cultural intelligence? Stephanie shares, become aware of holidays that are important to my team members and learn a new language. Tawana says, learn new holidays. Holidays are probably top of mind because of the season we're in. December starts tomorrow and Hanukkah started yesterday. And so we are in the season of a lot of holidays right now. Absolutely. Sarah says, get better at apologies that don't make excuses. Absolutely. You know, Sarah, it's interesting. Sometimes in my line of work, I hear people apologize and they make it more about the person who was hurt rather than themselves. And so the perfect apology is really owning up for what you did and being able to acknowledge that with sincerity. So I really like that comment, Sarah. Robinson says, be curious and asking questions, going deeper than small talk, and let me see, sharing, letting people share their personal stories and experiences. Raquel says, more mindful of scheduling meetings at times that make it easier to be inclusive of global partners. Absolutely. At a US-based company, we do that all of the time. And there's been a lot of feedback this year about not being inclusive of scheduling meetings because the time favors the US. And even within the US, it's difficult. We have West Coast people and East Coast, and it's kind of hard to get those timings right. Christian says, I would like to learn how to better ask semi-personal, culturally related questions without being intrusive. Very good. Teresa says, the Queens Public Library does so much programming around culture. I'll attend more events. Awesome. And that kind of takes the burden off of you, Teresa, to have to figure out where you can get plugged up and connected. If you can find a center or a place that may have cultural events, that's awesome, so that you can get connected and learn more. Perfect. Let me go into the next slide here. Oh, I went back. What's going on? There we go. So I did share this presentation with Robinson, and he has the PDF version of this deck. If you want to learn more about cultural intelligence, there are some great books here as a reading list. And I thank you for the time today. I was excited to present and to connect with this group, and I'd like to open up the floor to any questions we may have. Robinson, I'll pass it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rilla, for the presentation and sharing a little bit about cultural intelligence. I just kind of just was writing down some notes and kind of hearing a lot of, about in terms of globalization and how people, might be working with individuals from other parts of the world and how valuable it is, right, to really start understanding about people's backgrounds, people's cultures. So it does a really good way, and I'm assuming now with a lot of things going on virtual and Zoom, it's even more crucial, right, to really start getting a grasp of different cultures and being curious about it, being curious about understanding other people and help and trying to find ways to really meet genuine connections. So really, thank you so much. If anyone has questions, feel free to type them in the chat, or if you want, unmute yourself as well. We'd be happy to answer some questions as well as we go.
I would love to ask a question, if that's cool. I love the example about like a Brazilian stockbroker, that whole scenario, because I struggle with that fine line between like, oh, they're Brazilian, so they're this way. They're a stockbroker because they're this way, right? Versus that's Jim, that's how he is, right? So like singling out, like how exactly to ask questions, and it's hard to ask this question to get like responses, but anybody's recommendations on if there is a behavior that you're maybe curious about, going back to that slide, thinking about, well, what is informing that behavior? So just an example, and it's funny you put Brazilian. So I work with international students, and I was once recruiting doing an event in Brazil. And I met a student who's a third culture kid, if you know that term, like they're born in one place, raised in another, then going to another for education. And he was originally from Bangladesh, but now in Brazil. And I found them to be very different cultures. So he actually kept coming around the table and like invading my personal space. And so I wasn't like putting it in a box of like, that's this culture, that culture, but it was like he personally was doing that. But I just love that scenario of trying to parse out what is cultural, what is personal, what is it, the stockbroker part. So so I would love to hear more about using those recommendations kind of carefully in terms of not like pinning somebody just because that's their Brazilian culture or etc.
Yeah, Teresa, thank you for that question. And thank you for sharing that story. I think the more exposure you have to different cultures, particularly for those of the communities that you may be working with through your recruiting or even your team members, the more you can learn about those cultures, I think the more you're likely to pick up on those themes. So from your research or events or just talking to people from the same types of backgrounds, you'll pick up on what those themes are the more you immerse yourself in it. And, at the end of the day, a lot of the way we are just individually is such a combination of different things. It could be from childhood, the way we had a situation or a relationship with family members, parents, siblings. It could be from an environmental type of situation, maybe just witnessing or seeing what is praised or what is applauded or congratulated. And so a lot of things are truly intersectional, and it really is a combination in terms of how we show up. I know for myself personally, I just have this impatient streak in my personality. I like things fast. I like them done like yesterday. And that is not because I'm African American. It's not because I'm a woman. It's not because I'm from America. That's just my personality. So it's such an interesting way to think about the behaviors and the motivations of behaviors. But my best recommendation to you, Teresa, would be just immerse yourself in different cultures as much as you can, particularly for those that you are closely linked to. And the more you learn, the more you'll be able to pick up on those themes and those cultural norms for different areas. Certainly want to open up the floor to any other questions or comments, stories, discussion.
I just have a request. So I put in the chat that I would like to get a copy of the reading list. How is that possible?
Robinson, I think that one's for you.
Yes, so we are going to have the PowerPoint presentation up in our website, so I'll definitely link it up. I'll also share the link right now in the chat. So I have the presentation in a day or two. I'll upload it, and you'll have access to the presentation, the YouTube video, and everything you guys saw today.
Great, thank you.
I do have a question. Every year I lead a session for students about topics similar to this. And sometimes we get into talking about the dimensions of the 7 or 5 or however many there are now, dimensions of culture, and describing how they align with certain nationalities. And my students rightly point out that, a lot of this sounds a lot like stereotypes. Swiss are very punctual. How do you suggest that I address, that we can talk about tendencies within cultures to behave in a collective, in a certain manner, without jumping over the cliff into stereotyping? That's something I have trouble with, that very fine line.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Sarah. And I think there's a difference between a stereotype and a cultural norm. So I'll give an example. In some cultures, it is not polite to look someone into the eye and make that eye contact without having an invitation, because it's disrespectful to do that. So a cultural norm is like a general practice or a general way of how people are functioning. It's not positive or negative. That's just, what it is. And I think a lot of cultural norms really fall underneath the kind of like the umbrella of etiquette. Like, bowing, how to greet people, body language, eye contact, things like that. But stereotypes are usually things that are negative. So a stereotype of, for example, African Americans is that they're loud and women are angry. Well, that's not a cultural norm. That's a stereotype because it's something negative about a generalization of a particular group of people. And so the cultural norms are really like the habits and the rituals of how people are functioning. And it's not necessarily going to have that stain of like a negative opinion or anything that is disrespectful, because it's really just based on fact and not in opinion, if that makes sense, to kind of tell the difference between the two.
Yeah, I mean, stereotypes are more often negative, but you can also have positive ones as well. You know, all French people have great fashion sense. A lot of them do. So I find some truth in that, but it's in general, that's more of a positive trait. And yeah, so I have trouble nuancing this with students.
Yeah, and so much of culture is beyond, where we're from, around nationality, around race and ethnicity. It could be food or music. So much of culture spans beyond just, the particular identity dimensions that really tie us to who we are, in terms of nationality or race or ethnicity. And so I would just encourage you to look at the different types of culture and the different areas of culture and have conversations around some of those rituals. And it's great to have that understanding, particularly around holidays or different things that people value based on, those different cultural identities and cultural norms. Robinson, how much more time do we have for questions?
I'm just trying to see if there's any other questions anyone had or previously wrote in the chat. Let me just check. So I don't think there's really any other questions. I mean, if anyone has any comments they'd like to share, feel free to type it in the chat. And if not, we'll just give it a couple seconds.
I think the only sort of question that I have is sometimes I struggle with the best way to approach asking someone about their culture, like trying to find a way in so that it doesn't come off maybe as I don't as just a basic kind of common question, but more of one where I'm genuinely interested in learning more about it. But at the same time, I don't want it to sound insensitive in any way. So sometimes I struggle with that a bit. I don't know if you have any suggestions on that.
Yeah, so I think, Stephanie, if you have any context that you can use kind of like as a door opener, for example, if you saw someone, a coworker or a direct report, share something on LinkedIn about Diwali, you could then ask in a one-on-one meeting, maybe not a team meeting, but in a one-on-one to learn more about that and maybe learn about any other holidays, particularly the important dates. I think it might be easier when you are new in a connection, new in a relationship, if you could ask, well, what are the most important things to you? I just want to learn about you as a person, especially if you have that one-on-one time with a direct report. Just building rapport and showing and expressing that curiosity, not trying to pry, but just being curious to learn more about who someone is. At work, we focus so much on work, and it is important to do that. But at the end of the day, we are all people doing jobs. And so if you can prioritize and ask questions to really get to know someone as a person, and you could even say, work aside, what do you like to do outside of work for fun? I actually remember being asked that in a job interview once, what are your hobbies? And that only happened once or twice. I'm rarely asked about who I am as a person. And so you can certainly express that curiosity. And I think there may be a couple of other ideas here in the chat for you, Stephanie. someone said, one thing I do is ask questions, what makes you say that? And then someone else says, how do you make someone aware of their lack of cultural intelligence? Okay, calling it out may be difficult, but if you're going to do that, certainly a one-on-one type of format is easier to address. Maybe an action or a comment was done, and just, you know, like Teresa said, ask, well, what motivated you to say that? Or what inspired you to do that? And that's a great place to start the conversation, and then express your concern for how it may have been disrespectful or out of line, and what someone can do going forward, particularly if you are leading them or supervising them, Esther. I think that may be helpful. So that's kind of like a 2-for-1, but that's a really great question, Stephanie, and Teresa provided another good question. If you can kind of just get curious and ask someone, you know, a little bit more background on their thinking or their motivation behind a comment or an action.
Perfect. Thank you once again for sharing all that insight as well. I'm not sure. I'm not seeing any of the questions right now coming up in the chat. So I think we'll just kind of wrap it up. So thank you once again, Devoreaux, for really taking your time to share a little bit about cultural intelligence, get some insight in how we can apply it really at work and just in our personal lives as well. So thank you very much once again for taking your time. The PowerPoint presentation will definitely be put up, and we'll have some links in additional articles as well. So thank you once again, and thank you everyone else for coming in today.
Thank you. Happy holidays, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy
Bye-bye.
holidays.